Paris. Late at night, sometime after the war, in the small hours when the city belongs to no one. Outside on the Boulevard de Clichy, the great red windmill of the Moulin Rouge had stopped turning. Its lights were dark. The last tourists had paid their bills and drifted out into the cold. The doormen had gone home, and the famous red room, the room that had roared with music and laughter only an hour before, was almost completely empty. The chairs were being turned up onto the tables. A few glasses still stood half-finished where people had left them. And somewhere in that near darkness, without an announcement, without a spotlight, without a single poster promising she would appear, one voice began to sing. It was Edith Piaf. The small woman in the plain black dress, the voice of Paris, the woman whose records were selling across 2 continents. She was not on the schedule. No one had bought a ticket. She was singing to an empty room in the dead of night, for no audience, for no money, for no reason anyone could see. And one man stopped where he stood. A waiter, still holding a tray of dirty glasses, halfway to the kitchen, froze in the doorway and did not move. He would tell this story for the rest of his life, and most people who love her music have never heard a word of it. And what of the woman herself? By this point in her life, Edith Piaf had already climbed further than anyone had a right to expect. She had been born into nothing, raised in the hardest corners of Paris, a girl who had once sung on street corners for whatever coins strangers were willing to drop. Now her name was on records, on marquees, in newspapers across the ocean. She had become the voice of a country that had just come through years of war and wanted something to believe in again. But fame did not soften the things that lived inside her. Those who worked beside her in those years spoke of a woman who carried an enormous loneliness behind all that applause. She could hold a theater of 2,000 people in the palm of her hand, bend every one of them to a single held note, and then walk off stage into a silence that no crowd could fill. The bigger the ovation, the emptier the dressing room seemed afterward. There is a particular kind of tiredness that belongs only to people who are loved by everyone and known by almost no one. She had it. On nights like the one at the Moulin Rouge, when the show was done and the crowds were gone, she did not always want to go home. Home, wherever it was often the loneliest room of all. So sometimes she lingered. She stayed behind in the emptying rooms of Paris, among the waiters and the stagehands, the people who had seen too much to be impressed by fame. With them, she did not have to be the voice of France. She could just be a woman who did not want the night to end. To understand why that night mattered, you have to understand what the Moulin Rouge was. By the time Edith Piaf stood in that empty room, the red windmill on the edge of Montmartre had already been famous for half a century. It was the place where Paris came to forget itself. The dancers, the noise, the color, the crush of bodies at the little tables, the champagne, the laughter that went on until the lamps guttered out. Tourists came from all over the world just to say they had been there. But there were 2 Moulin Rouges, and only the people who worked there knew both. There was the Moulin Rouge of the show, all feathers and spectacle, built to be seen. And there was the other one, the one that appeared after the last customer left, When the doors were locked and the money was counted, the great red room became something else entirely. Quiet, ordinary. A tired place full of tired people. The waiters wiping down tables. The musicians packing away their instruments. Everyone thinking of the long walk home. In those hours, the magic did not stop so much as it changed shape. The performers who had been larger than life all evening became simply people again. Human beings in a cold room at the end of a working night. And it was in exactly that hour, when the spectacle was over and no one was performing for anyone, that the most honest things sometimes happened. The room in its makeup belonged to the paying crowds, but the room with its makeup wiped off belonged to whoever was still standing in it. Why she sang that night, no one can say with certainty. Perhaps a melody had been circling in her head and would not leave her alone. Perhaps she was trying a phrase, testing how a line would sit in her throat when there was no crowd to please and nothing to prove. Perhaps she simply could not bear to walk out into the cold just yet, and singing was the only way she knew to hold the night open a little longer. What is certain is that she was not performing. There was no audience to perform for. The paying crowds were gone. The reviewers were asleep. The men who managed her career and counted her earnings were nowhere near. There was no one to impress and nothing to gain. And that, strangely, is the rarest condition in the life of a famous person. To do the thing you are known for, the thing the whole world watches you do, with absolutely no one watching. For most stars, it never happens. Someone is always looking. But in that emptied red room, for a few minutes, Edith Piaf had something almost no one at her level of fame ever gets. Privacy. The chance to sing purely for the sake of singing, the way she must have sung as a girl on the street before anyone was listening, before the whole machine of fame had grown up around her voice. And so she opened her mouth in the dark, and out came not the performance the world paid for, but the thing underneath it. The waiter, without meaning to, had walked into the one moment he was never supposed to see. The waiter, meanwhile, was nobody. History does not even keep his name reliably. He was one of the countless working men who kept the great cabarets of Paris running, the ones who arrived before the lights went up and stayed long after they went dark. He carried trays, he wiped spills, he counted the hours until he could go home to a small room somewhere across the city and sleep before doing it all again. For a man like that, Edith Piaf was not a legend. She was a face he saw at work. He had served her coffee, cleared her table, watched her come and go 100 times without ever once speaking a word that mattered. To him, she was simply the small woman in black who happened to be famous, the way the room he cleaned every night happened to be world famous, which is to say, not something he thought about very much. That is what makes what happened next so extraordinary. Because on this particular night, he was doing exactly what he always did, moving a tray of dirty glasses toward the kitchen through a room he had walked 10,000 times. He was not looking for a miracle. He was tired, and he wanted to go home. And then, behind him, in the dark and near-empty room, a voice began to sing. Not the voice he had heard from the stage all night, polished and projected and pushed out to the last row. Something quieter. Something meant for no one. And a man who thought he had heard Edith Piaf many times discovered, in that moment, that he had never really heard her at all. When the last note faded, she did not take a bow. There was no one to bow to. She lowered her head for a moment, gathered her coat around her small shoulders, and made her way through the dark toward the door, passing close enough to the waiter that he could have spoken to her. He did not. He simply stepped aside and let her pass, and she went out into the Paris night without ever knowing that anyone had heard. And that is the detail that has kept this story alive for so long. She never knew. To Edith Piaf, that performance never happened. It was not a concert, not a recording, not a moment she could point to and say, "There, that was one of my nights." As far as she was concerned, she had sung to an empty room and gone home, and the whole thing had vanished into the dark the moment it ended. But it had not vanished. It had lodged itself in the memory of one tired man who happened to be carrying a tray at the wrong or the right moment. He kept it for decades. He told it to his family, to friends, to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen, and every time he told it, his voice would change, and the people around him would go quiet, because they could hear that he was describing the single most important thing that had ever happened to him. Not the shows he had served at, not the famous faces he had seen. This. A song no one was supposed to hear, in a room no one was supposed to be in, given away for free by a woman who did not know she was giving anything at all. The waiter would describe it years later, always reaching for words and never quite finding them. He said the voice was smaller than the one he knew from the stage, and somehow far larger. On the stage, she threw her voice out over the heads of the crowd, filling the room to its gilded ceiling. Here, in the empty dark, she did the opposite. She pulled the voice inward. It was as if she were not singing to a room at all, but to one person who was no longer there, or to some part of herself that only came out when the lights went down. He said he was afraid to move. He was standing in the doorway with a tray of dirty glasses growing heavy in his hands, and he did not dare set it down for fear the smallest sound would break the spell and she would stop. So he stood, and he listened. A tired working man at the end of a long shift, holding his breath in a doorway, while the most famous voice in France sang a song meant for absolutely no one. He said the strangest part was her face. On the stage, all evening, she had worn the face of a performer, controlled, deliberate, every expression placed exactly where it belonged. Now that face was gone. What he saw instead was something unguarded, something private, the face of a person who believed she was completely alone. And he understood, standing there, that he was seeing something he had no right to see, and that he would never in his life see anything like it again. He did not applaud when she finished. He could not. To make a sound would have been to admit he had been there. So he simply stood in the dark and let the silence come back, and carried the memory out with him like something stolen. It is easy, when we remember the great singers, to remember only the big nights, the sold-out halls, the famous recordings, the ovations that went on so long the performers had to beg the crowd to let them leave. Those nights are real, and they matter. But this story is a reminder that the truest moments of an artist's life are almost never the ones we were allowed to buy a ticket for. The voice the world paid to hear at the Moulin Rouge was extraordinary. But the voice that came out of Edith Piaf when she thought no one was listening, that was something else. Something she never sold and never explained, and perhaps never fully understood herself. It says something about her that she would stand in an empty room and sing with everything she had, when there was nothing to gain by it. It tells you that the singing was never really about the crowd. It was about the thing inside her that needed to come out. Crowd or no crowd, spotlight or no spotlight. And it says something about the rest of us too. That the most unforgettable moment in one man's entire life came not because he was chosen, not because he had a ticket, but because he happened to be standing in a doorway at the right hour, and he had the sense to stop and listen. Long after the last tourists had left the Moulin Rouge and the red windmill had gone dark, one voice sang to an almost empty room. Only one man heard it, and because he did, so in a way do we. I thought I knew Edith Piaf, but I had never heard this story.